They said he was untouchable. $4.2 billion. A penthouse on Fifth Avenue. Lawyers who had never lost a case. Marcus Weston walked into that Manhattan
I thought
courtroom
moving here would
with his
change everything.
26-year-old mistress on his arm, ready to throw his wife of 25 years away like yesterday's garbage.
Miss Blake?
He offered her $5 million.
Guilty?
That is less than 1/4 of
I know I shouldn't be
1%
here,
of
but
what
I
he
have
was
proof.
actually worth.
Emma,
He thought she would cry.
is that really
He
you?
thought she would beg.
This is the
He thought
critical
she would
juncture
take
in the
whatever
timeline.
crumbs
We
he
move
offered
here.
and disappear quietly.
But what about
He was
the
so
structural
very
weaknesses
wrong.
on level 2?
Because the quiet woman sitting across the courtroom had spent 2 decades building a trap so perfect, so invisible, that he would not see it until the jaws snapped shut around everything he owned. What Marcus did not know was that his own mother had betrayed him from beyond the grave. What he did not know was that his daughter would switch sides at the worst possible moment. What he did not know was that the algorithm that built his entire empire was never his to begin with. He stole her work. He stole her youth. He tried to steal her dignity. But Claire Weston was about to steal something back. Everything. This is not just a divorce story. This is a masterclass in patience, strategy, and the most satisfying revenge you will ever witness. Stay until the end. Because the moment the judge reads that final ruling, your jaw will hit the floor. Value statement and lesson. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. The best revenge is not making him suffer. It is building a life so good that he becomes irrelevant. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. This story is for every woman who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told she was nothing without him. You are about to watch a woman prove exactly how wrong that belief can be. Meaning of the story, this is more than entertainment. This is a reminder that truth does not stay buried forever. It is proof that patience and documentation can defeat money and power. It is evidence that mothers protect their daughters. Sisters stand by sisters, and the bonds between women can survive anything. Claire lost everything before she won. That is the part most people skip. But you need to hear it, because her lowest moment is what makes her victory so sweet. The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan Supreme Court did not simply open. They were thrust apart by a security detail that cost more than most families earned in a year. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning strikes, bouncing off the polished marble floors and illuminating the face of a man who believed he had already won. Marcus Weston stepped into the chaos with the practiced grin of someone who had never been told no. At 49 years old, he was the undisputed king of Silicon Valley, the face of Weston Technologies, and according to Forbes, the 14th richest man in America with a net worth of $4.2 billion. His charcoal gray suit cost $12,000. His watch cost more than a house in the suburbs. His teeth had been whitened to a shade that seemed to glow under the camera flashes. But the cameras were not just there for him. They were there for the woman clinging to his arm like an accessory, draped in a scarlet dress that left little to the imagination. Tiffany Blake was 26 years old, an Instagram influencer with 2.8 million followers, and according to every tabloid in America, the future Mrs. Weston. She smiled at the reporters with the confidence of someone who had already spent the money she expected to inherit. "Mr. Weston," a reporter shouted from behind the velvet rope, "is it true you are offering your wife only $5 million in the divorce?" Marcus paused, adjusting his diamond cufflinks with theatrical precision. He winked at the camera. "I am a generous man," he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he had perfected over thousands of investor presentations. "But let us just say, I believe in fair market value." The crowd laughed. Marcus Weston always knew how to work a room. He strutted down the center aisle of the courtroom, Tiffany clicking along beside him in stilettos that echoed sharply against the hardwood. He nodded to his legal team, a formation of sharks in $1,000 suits led by Victor Crane, a man known in New York legal circles simply as the Butcher. Crane had never lost a divorce case in 20 years. His specialty was destroying spouses who dared to ask for what they deserved. "Sit down," Crane whispered, as Marcus slid into the leather chair beside him. "Try to look somewhat humble." "Why?" Marcus whispered back, loosening his tie slightly. "The prenup is ironclad. The company is in my name. The offshore accounts are invisible. She gets the lake house in Connecticut and enough sympathy to last a lifetime. I get everything else." Marcus swiveled in his chair to look at the other side of the aisle. There sat Claire Weston. If Marcus was the sun, burning bright and demanding attention, Claire was a shadow. She wore a navy blazer that was at least 3 seasons old. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore no makeup to hide the dark circles beneath her eyes, evidence of too many sleepless nights spent wondering how 25 years of marriage had led to this moment. She sat almost alone, save for a young woman in a modest gray suit who looked more like a recent law school graduate than a seasoned litigator. Her name was Evelyn Rhodes, and Victor Crane had already dismissed her as a nuisance. Claire stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. Her hands were folded calmly on a stack of manila folders. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at Tiffany. She simply waited. "She looks tired," Tiffany whispered into Marcus's ear, her voice loud enough to carry across the aisle. "Maybe she is ready to give up." "She gave up years ago," Marcus scoffed. "This is just the paperwork," the bailiff's voice boomed through the murmuring gallery. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Patricia Monroe presiding. Judge Patricia Monroe was a legend in the New York court system. At 61 years old, she had presided over some of the most contentious divorces in the state's history. Her face was weathered but sharp, her eyes carrying the weight of every lie she had ever heard from the witness stand. She was known among attorneys as the equalizer, a judge who had zero tolerance for wealthy men who believed their money made them untouchable. She swept in with her black robes billowing and took her seat. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering on Tiffany's inappropriate dress with visible distaste before landing on Marcus. "Be seated," Judge Monroe commanded. Case number 492-B, Weston versus Weston, petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets. She shuffled through her papers with practiced efficiency. "I have reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Crane, you represent the petitioner, Mr. Weston. Miss Rhodes, you represent the respondent, Mrs. Weston. Is that correct?" "Ready, Your Honor," Crane said, standing with the confidence of a man who had already counted his victory bonus. "Ready, Your Honor," Evelyn Rhodes replied. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Let us not waste time," Judge Monroe said. "Mr. Weston is petitioning for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences and is seeking enforcement of a prenuptial agreement signed in 1998. Is that correct?" "It is, Your Honor," Crane said, stepping into the open floor. He began to pace, a performance he had perfected over 2 decades. "My client, Mr. Weston, built Weston Technologies from a garage startup into a global empire valued at over $30 billion. While he has deep respect for his wife of 25 years, the reality is that the marriage has irretrievably broken down. We are offering Mrs. Weston a generous settlement of $5 million, plus the property in Connecticut, which is more than fair considering she has not contributed to the business operations in over 2 decades. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He caught Claire's eye from across the aisle. She did not blink. She did not look angry. She looked calculating. It unnerved him for just a moment, but then Tiffany squeezed his hand under the table, and the feeling passed. "Miss Rhodes?" Judge Monroe turned to Claire's attorney. Does the defense contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement? Evelyn Rhodes stood up slowly. She did not pace. She did not use dramatic hand gestures. She simply adjusted her glasses and spoke in a voice that was deceptively calm. "We do not contest the prenup, Your Honor." A ripple of surprise went through the gallery. Even Marcus blinked. Victor Crane allowed himself a small smirk. "She is folding already," he whispered to Marcus. "This will be over by lunch." "However," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening slightly, "we contest the ownership of the assets listed by Mr. Weston. My client contends that Mr. Weston cannot claim the company as a marital asset to be divided because Mr. Weston does not actually own Weston Technologies." The courtroom went silent. Marcus laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He covered his mouth quickly, but the damage was done. "Mr. Weston," Judge Monroe snapped, her eyes narrowing, "do you find something amusing?" "I apologize, Your Honor," Marcus said, standing and flashing his most charming smile. "It is just that there must be some mistake. I am the CEO. My name is literally on the building. I founded the company. The defense suggests otherwise," Judge Monroe said, turning back to Evelyn. "Explain, Miss Rhodes." "Mr. Weston is indeed the CEO," Evelyn said calmly. "He is a paid employee of Weston Technologies. But the actual ownership of the holding company that controls the intellectual property, the patents, and the majority voting stock belongs to a private trust. And today, we intend to prove that the beneficiary of that trust is not Marcus Weston." Marcus leaned over to Crane, his confident smile finally cracking. "What is she talking about? I signed the incorporation papers myself 20 years ago." Victor Crane was already shuffling through his files, his practiced composure slipping. "It is a delay tactic," he whispered. "She is grasping at straws. Let me handle it." But as Marcus looked across the aisle, he saw Claire finally turn her head. She looked directly at him, and for the first time in years, he saw something in her eyes that he did not recognize. It was not love. It was not hate. It was the cold, clinical look of a predator watching prey walk into a trap it could not see. And in that moment, Marcus Weston felt the first flicker of fear he had experienced in 25 years. The first day of the trial had not gone as Marcus expected, but he remained confident. Victor Crane assured him that Evelyn Rhodes was bluffing, that there was no possible way Claire could own anything. The prenup was solid. The company was in his name. The offshore accounts were untraceable. By the time Marcus returned to his penthouse that evening, he had convinced himself that the momentary unease he felt in the courtroom was nothing more than indigestion from the overpriced sushi Tiffany had ordered for lunch. But Claire Weston was not at her penthouse that evening. She was sitting on a park bench in Central Park, clutching her phone with trembling hands, trying to remember how to breathe. The ambush had come 3 hours before the trial began. Claire had arrived at what she believed was a routine mediation meeting at her attorney's office. Instead, she found the office empty. Her lawyer, the one she had trusted for months, had left a single note on the desk. "I am sorry. I cannot continue with your case. Please find alternative representation. No explanation, no forwarding information. Just abandonment." Claire had stood in that empty office, staring at the note, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. It was not until she checked her phone that she understood what had happened. Her bank accounts were frozen. All of them. 25 years of marriage, and she had never thought to open an account in her own name alone. Everything was joint. And Marcus had locked her out. There was a voicemail from Marcus's attorney, Victor Crane, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Mrs. Weston, I regret to inform you that your husband has filed an emergency motion claiming mental instability. We have obtained a temporary restraining order. You are not permitted to return to the residence on Fifth Avenue until further notice. Please make alternative arrangements." mental instability. The words echoed in Claire's mind as she sat on that park bench, watching the sun set over the Manhattan skyline. 25 years. She had given him 25 years of her life. She had abandoned her PhD program at Columbia to support his dream. She had raised their daughter while he built his empire. She had smiled for the cameras at charity galas while he flirted with younger women in plain sight. And now she was sitting on a park bench with $47 in her purse, locked out of her own home, with no lawyer and no plan. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her sister Diane. Saw the news. Where are you? Call me now. Claire's fingers trembled as she dialed the number. Diane answered on the first ring. Claire, what is happening? I just saw Marcus on television walking into court with that Instagram girl. Are you okay? Claire tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, a sound came out that she did not recognize. It was the sound of 25 years of suppressed pain finally breaking free. Oh, honey, Diane said, her voice softening. Where are you? I am coming to get you right now. I do not know what to do, Claire finally managed to whisper. He took everything, Diane. The accounts, the house. My lawyer quit this morning. He filed papers saying I am mentally unstable. That lying snake, Diane hissed. Okay, listen to me. You are going to stay exactly where you are. I am getting in my car right now. You are coming to stay with me. We are going to figure this out. I gave him everything. Claire's voice broke. I do not even know who I am anymore. There was a pause on the line. When Diane spoke again, her voice was fierce. You are Claire Elizabeth Holloway Weston. You are my baby sister. You are the smartest person I have ever known. And that man has spent 25 years making you forget it. But I never forgot. And starting tonight, we are going to make him remember exactly who he messed with. 2 hours later, Claire was sitting at the small kitchen table in Diane's modest apartment above the bakery she owned in Brooklyn. The contrast to the penthouse on Fifth Avenue was stark. The furniture was old, the appliances were older, the walls were decorated with family photographs and handwritten recipes. But it was warm, and it was safe. Diane placed a cup of tea in front of Claire and sat down across from her, her face set in grim determination. Okay, she said, tell me everything, from the beginning. Claire wrapped her hands around the warm cup and began to talk. She told Diane about the algorithm she had written in 1998, the one that became the foundation of Weston Technologies. She told her about the patent Marcus had filed while she was recovering from Emma's difficult birth, the patent that should have had her name on it but did not. She told her about the offshore accounts she had discovered 3 months ago when she accidentally intercepted a wire transfer confirmation meant for Marcus's private email. $200 million hidden in the Cayman Islands. Money that should have been marital property. She told her about hiring a forensic accountant to trace the funds, about gathering evidence, about preparing for a divorce that would finally give her what she deserved. And then she told her about this morning, about arriving at the mediation meeting to find her lawyer gone, bribed by Victor Crane to abandon her case at the worst possible moment. So let me understand this, Diane said slowly. You had evidence, you had a plan, and they somehow knew exactly what you were doing and torpedoed it before you could act. Someone talked, Claire said. Someone on my team. I do not know who. Diane leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. What about that forensic accountant? The one who found the offshore money? Gerald Morrison, Claire said. I trusted him completely. Maybe you should not have. Claire looked at her sister, realization dawning slowly. You think Marcus got to him too? Honey, Diane said, reaching across the table to take Claire's hand. When a man has $4 billion, and no conscience, he can get to anyone. The question is not who he bought. The question is who he cannot buy. The next morning, Claire discovered exactly how far Marcus's reach extended. She walked into the Manhattan Supreme Court, wearing borrowed clothes from Diane's closet, having spent the night on her sister's lumpy sofa. She had no lawyer, she had no money, she had nothing but the folder of documents she had managed to grab from her home office before security escorted her out. And standing at the entrance to the courtroom was Victor Crane, waiting for her with a smile that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Weston," he said smoothly, "I am glad I caught you before we went inside. My client has asked me to convey a final settlement offer. $10 million. That is double what we originally proposed. Sign today, and this all goes away." Claire stared at him. $10 million. It was more money than most people would see in a lifetime. It was also less than 1/4% of what Marcus was actually worth. "No," she said. Crane's smile flickered but did not disappear. "Mrs. Weston, I strongly advise you to reconsider. You have no legal representation. Your bank accounts are frozen. The evidence you plan to present has been compromised. You are, if you will forgive me for saying so, completely alone." Claire felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. Everything he said was true. She had no lawyer, no money, no plan. But she also had nothing left to lose. "Then, I will represent myself," she said, and pushed past him into the courtroom. "Your Honor," Claire said, her voice shaking but clear, "I request a 2-week continuance to obtain new legal counsel." Judge Monroe studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at Victor Crane. "Any objection from the petitioner?" Crane stood, his voice oozing false concern. "Your Honor, my client is eager to resolve this matter expeditiously. Mrs. Weston has had ample time to prepare. A continuance would only prolong the inevitable." Judge Monroe's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Crane," she said coldly, "a woman standing alone against one of the most expensive legal teams in the country is asking for 2 weeks to find representation. I am going to grant that request. And if I hear one more word from you suggesting that basic fairness is an inconvenience, I will hold you in contempt." She banged her gavel. 2-week continuance granted. Court is adjourned. As Claire gathered her papers with trembling hands, she looked across the aisle at Marcus. He was whispering something to Tiffany, probably already dismissing this small victory as meaningless. But then Claire saw someone else, a young woman sitting in the back of the gallery, watching her with curious eyes. Evelyn Rhodes. After the courtroom cleared, Evelyn approached Claire in the hallway. "Mrs. Weston," she said, "my name is Evelyn Rhodes. I graduated from Columbia Law 3 years ago. I have never handled a case this big. I have no resources and no staff. But I watched what happened in there, and I think I can help you." Claire looked at this young woman, barely older than her own daughter, offering to stand beside her against a Goliath. "Why would you do that?" Claire asked. "You know who you would be going up against." Evelyn smiled, and for the first time that day, Claire saw something that looked like hope. "Because 15 years ago, Victor Crane destroyed my mother in her divorce," she said. "She died broke and broken. I have been waiting my whole career for a chance to return the favor. And Missy Weston, I think you might just be that chance." The war room was not in a gleaming law office with skyline views. It was in the cramped back room of Diane's Bakery in Brooklyn, surrounded by flour-dusted shelves and the lingering scent of fresh bread. But in the 2 weeks since Evelyn Rhodes had offered to take Claire's case, it had become the center of operations for the most important legal battle of their lives. Papers covered every surface. Whiteboards lined the walls, filled with timelines and connections and questions that still needed answers. Diane kept them supplied with coffee and pastries, while Evelyn worked 18-hour days, digging through 25 years of financial records. But it was Claire who made the breakthrough. She had been staring at the original patent filing for Weston Technologies, the document that had launched a $30 billion empire. The patent was for a revolutionary data compression algorithm, the kind of mathematical innovation that could make computers work faster, store more information, and process data with unprecedented efficiency. Marcus's name was the only one on the filing. April 14th, 1999. The date was etched in Claire's memory for a different reason. "That was the day after I gave birth to Emma," Claire said quietly, looking up from the document. "I was in the hospital for 3 days. There were complications. I almost died." Evelyn stopped typing. "He filed the patent while you were in the hospital?" Claire nodded, her jaw tightening. "I did not find out until years later. By then, the company was already worth millions. He told me it did not matter whose name was on the paperwork. He said we were partners. He said, what was his was mine." "But the algorithm itself," Evelyn pressed. "Where did it come from?" Claire was silent for a long moment. Then she walked to the window, looking out at the Brooklyn street below. "I was a PhD candidate in applied mathematics at Columbia. My thesis was on recursive data compression. I had developed a theoretical model that could revolutionize how computers processed information, but I could not figure out how to make it practical." She turned back to face Evelyn. Marcus was a business major. Smart, charming, full of big ideas but no technical knowledge. We met at a party. He heard me talking about my research, and he became obsessed with it. He said he could turn my theory into a product. He just needed me to help him understand the math. "So, you taught him?" "I wrote it for him." Claire's voice was bitter. "I spent 6 months translating my theoretical model into actual code. I worked nights and weekends while he pitched investors. And when the company took off, I was too busy raising Emma and too naive to realize he had cut me out completely." "Do you have any proof?" Evelyn asked. "Your original research, notes, drafts, anything?" Claire shook her head. "It was almost 30 years ago. I kept everything on floppy disks. They are long gone." Diane, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "What about your thesis advisor, the professor at Columbia? Would they have records?" Claire froze. "Professor Harold Bennett," she said slowly. "He was my dissertation chair. I dropped out when Emma was born, but he kept all his student files. He was obsessive about documentation." "Is he still alive?" Evelyn asked, already reaching for her laptop. "He would be almost 80 now, but last I heard, he had retired to Vermont." 3 days later, Claire and Evelyn drove 4 hours north to a small farmhouse outside Burlington. Harold Bennett was 79 years old, mostly deaf, and initially suspicious of the 2 women who appeared unannounced on his doorstep. But when Claire mentioned her maiden name and the research she had been working on in 1997, the old professor's eyes lit up with recognition. "Claire Holloway," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "The most brilliant student I ever had. I was devastated when you dropped out. That compression algorithm you developed was years ahead of its time." "Do you still have my research files?" Claire asked, hardly daring to hope. Professor Bennett laughed. "Young lady, I have kept every student file since 1972. My wife calls me a hoarder. I prefer the term archivist." He led them to a barn behind the house that had been converted into a storage facility. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each one labeled by year and student name. After an hour of searching, Professor Bennett pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Claire. Inside were her original handwritten notes, dated and initialed by Professor Bennett himself as part of the academic review process. The theoretical framework, the mathematical proofs, the preliminary code she had developed, and the date on the final document was February 18th, 1998, more than a year before Marcus filed his patent. "This proves I developed the algorithm," Claire said, her voice trembling. "This proves it was my work." Evelyn was already photographing every page. "This proves more than that," she said grimly. "This proves Marcus Weston committed patent fraud. He filed a patent for intellectual property that was not his. This could invalidate the entire foundation of his company." Professor Bennett cleared his throat. "There is something else you should know," he said. "A few months after you dropped out, a young man came to see me. Well-dressed, arrogant. He said he was your husband and he wanted to buy any copies of your research I might have." Claire went pale. "Marcus came here? I told him I did not do business with people who came sniffing around my students like vultures," Professor Bennett said with satisfaction. "I also told him I would be keeping those files until the day I died, and if he ever came back, I would report him to the University Ethics Board." He looked at Claire with unexpected gentleness. "I always wondered what happened to you, Claire. I always wondered if you knew what that man did with your work." Claire could not speak. The tears were streaming down her face. "I know now," she finally managed, "and I am going to make sure the whole world knows too." The drive back to New York was quiet. Claire sat in the passenger seat, clutching the folder of documents like it was a lifeline. "This changes everything," Evelyn said as they crossed into Massachusetts. "If we can prove Marcus built his entire empire on stolen intellectual property, we can challenge not just the divorce settlement, but the ownership of the company itself." "But there is still the prenup," Claire said. "Even if I can prove the algorithm was mine, the prenup says all business assets belong to him." Evelyn smiled. "That is the thing about prenups. They are contracts. And contracts can be voided if they were signed under false pretenses or coercion." She glanced at Claire. "Tell me about the day you signed that prenup." Claire closed her eyes, remembering a day she had tried to forget. It was the night before our wedding. 300 guests had already arrived for the ceremony the next morning. Marcus came to me and said his lawyers insisted on a prenuptial agreement. He said it was just a formality. He said if I loved him, I would sign it without reading it. And if you refused? Claire's voice was bitter. He said he would cancel the wedding in front of everyone. My parents had spent their life savings on that ceremony. My mother was dying of cancer. She lived just long enough to see me walk down the aisle. She opened her eyes. So I signed it. I signed away everything because I was 22 years old and terrified, and I believed him when he said it did not matter. That is coercion, Evelyn said firmly. That prenup was signed under duress. If we can prove that, we can void it entirely. For the first time in weeks, Claire felt something that might have been hope. But as they drove through the darkness toward New York City, neither of them knew that Marcus Weston had already learned about their visit to Vermont. And he was preparing a counterattack that would make everything they had discovered irrelevant. The courtroom was packed for the resumed hearing. Word had spread through legal circles that something unusual was happening in the Weston divorce case. Reporters lined the back rows. Board members from Weston Technologies sat in the gallery, their faces grim with concern about what these proceedings might mean for their stock options. Marcus Weston sat at the petitioner's table, his confidence somewhat diminished since the first day. Victor Crane had assured him that whatever evidence Claire had found was meaningless. But the old professor in Vermont was a complication they had not anticipated. Still, Marcus reminded himself, Victor had never lost a case. And besides, there was still the secret weapon. Claire entered with Evelyn Rhodes, both women carrying boxes of documents. Claire had found strength in the past 2 weeks. She walked with her head held high, her shoulders back, no longer the shadow who had trembled on that first day. Diane sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing her best church dress and an expression that dared anyone to challenge her presence. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Patricia Monroe presiding. Judge Monroe took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with keen eyes. "We are resuming the matter of Weston versus Weston. Miss Rhodes, I understand you have new evidence to present." "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn said, standing with quiet confidence. "The defense wishes to challenge the ownership of Weston Technologies on the grounds of patent fraud and intellectual property theft." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Victor Crane rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a divorce proceeding, not a patent court. The ownership of assets is directly relevant to the division of marital property," Evelyn countered. "If the primary asset was built on stolen intellectual property, that affects its status in these proceedings." Judge Monroe considered this. "I will allow the evidence." "Proceed, Miss Rhodes." Evelyn presented the documents from Professor Bennett methodically. The original research notes, the dated proof, the timeline showing that Claire had developed the compression algorithm more than a year before Marcus filed the patent. She called Professor Harold Bennett to testify via video link, his voice trembling with age but clear in his assertions. Claire Holloway developed that algorithm. It was entirely her original work. Marcus Weston contributed nothing to the underlying mathematics. When Evelyn finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Marcus's board members looked shaken, but Victor Crane was smiling. "Your Honor," he said, rising slowly, "the petitioner does not dispute that Mrs. Weston assisted with some early research. However, we have evidence that will put this matter in proper context." He turned toward the gallery doors. "We call Emma Weston to the stand." Claire's heart stopped. Her daughter. Her 22-year-old daughter, Emma, whom she had not seen in 3 weeks because Marcus had convinced her to move into his new apartment in Tribeca. Emma walked into the courtroom wearing a crisp business suit that Claire did not recognize. Her hair was styled in a way Claire had never seen before. She looked like a younger, colder version of herself. She did not look at her mother as she took the stand. "Miss Weston," Victor Crane began, his voice warm and fatherly, "I know this is difficult, but can you tell the court about your mother's behavior during your childhood?" Emma's voice was flat, rehearsed. "My mother was emotionally absent. She was always in her own world. She resented my father's success because she could not achieve anything herself. Claire felt like she had been stabbed." "And did your mother ever discuss her supposed contributions to your father's company?" "She complained constantly," Emma said. "She said my father stole her ideas, but she never had any proof. It was just jealousy." Victor Crane nodded sympathetically. "We would like to enter into evidence a series of text messages between mother and daughter, Your Honor." He handed copies to the judge and to Evelyn. Claire looked at the messages, her hands shaking. They were real texts she had sent to Emma over the years. Moments of frustration, complaints about Marcus, angry words sent in moments of weakness. But they had been carefully selected and stripped of context to make her look bitter, unstable, and obsessed. "As you can see, Your Honor," Crane said smoothly, "Mrs. Weston has a long history of making unfounded accusations against her husband. This so-called evidence from Professor Bennett is simply the latest chapter in her campaign of jealousy." Emma continued her testimony, each word a dagger in Claire's heart. "My father built that company from nothing. My mother just wanted credit she did not deserve. She never supported him. She only wanted his money." When it was Evelyn's turn to cross-examine, she approached carefully. "Miss Weston," she said gently, "do you love your mother?" Emma's composure cracked slightly. "That is not relevant." "Do you love your mother?" Evelyn repeated. "Objection," Crane called. badgering the witness. Withdrawn, Evelyn said. She looked at Emma with something like pity. No further questions. Emma stepped down from the stand without looking at Claire. She walked to the back of the courtroom and sat beside Marcus, who put his arm around her shoulders with theatrical pride. The cameras captured everything. That evening, the headlines were brutal. Billionaire daughter chooses father over bitter mother. Weston divorce takes ugly turn as child testifies against mom. Tech heiress says mother was emotionally absent and jealous. Claire sat in the bakery kitchen, the newspapers spread before her, unable to cry because she had no tears left. Diane sat across from her face tight with fury. That snake coached her, Diane said. He spent 3 weeks poisoning her against you. She is my daughter, Claire whispered. How could she say those things? Because she does not know the truth, Diane said. She only knows what he told her, and right now, she believes him. The door to the kitchen opened, and an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes stepped in. Betty Crawford had been Claire's housekeeper for 15 years. She had watched Emma grow up. She had seen everything. Mrs. Weston, Betty said quietly, I heard what happened. I am so sorry. Claire looked up. Betty, what are you doing here? Betty sat down at the table, her weathered hands folded in her lap. I have been watching that man for 15 years, Betty said. I have seen how he treats you. I have seen the lies he tells. And I have been keeping records. She pulled a worn notebook from her purse. Dates, she said. Times. Names of the women he brought to the house when you were traveling. The arguments I overheard. The threats he made. Everything. Claire stared at the notebook. You did this for me? I did it because I knew this day would come, Betty said firmly, and I wanted to make sure that when it did, you would have the truth. Evelyn took the notebook and began flipping through pages. Her eyes widened. This is incredible, she said. Betty, this is 15 years of documentation, dates of infidelities, records of financial conversations, evidence of emotional abuse. I have a good memory, Betty said simply, and I write things down. But Claire was looking at Betty with concern. If you testify, she said, Marcus will destroy you. He will make sure you never work again. Betty met her eyes steadily. Mrs. Weston, I am 58 years old. My husband died last year. I have nothing left to lose. And after 15 years of watching that man hurt you, I would like very much to finally do something about it. The victory over the prenup came suddenly and felt like salvation. Evelyn had argued brilliantly before Judge Monroe, presenting witnesses who had attended the wedding 25 years ago. Claire's cousin remembered Marcus threatening to cancel everything the night before. A bridesmaid recalled Claire crying in the bathroom, saying she felt she had no choice. The prenuptial agreement was signed under duress, Judge Monroe ruled, her voice cutting through the courtroom. It is hereby declared void. Claire had wept with relief. Diane had shouted from the gallery and nearly gotten thrown out. Even Evelyn, who usually maintained professional composure, had allowed herself a small smile. That evening, they celebrated at the bakery with cheap wine and leftover croissants. For the first time in months, Claire laughed. We might actually win this, she said. Disbelief and hope mingled in her voice. We are going to win this, Evelyn corrected. The algorithm evidence stands. Betty's testimony will corroborate the pattern of abuse. And without the prenup, you are entitled to equitable distribution of all marital assets. Diane raised her glass. To the downfall of Marcus Weston, she declared. They clinked glasses. 48 hours later, everything fell apart. Claire was in the war room, reviewing documents with Evelyn, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. Second prenup surfaces in Weston divorce. Wife allegedly signed revised agreement in 2015. Claire's blood went cold. What? She whispered. Evelyn was already pulling up the article. Marcus Weston's legal team has produced a second prenuptial agreement allegedly signed by Claire Weston in 2015. The document, which supersedes the original 1998 agreement, contains even more restrictive terms for the division of assets. "There is no second prenup," Claire said, her voice rising with panic. "I never signed anything in 2015." But even as she said it, a memory stirred. 2015. The year of the miscarriage. The year she had spent 3 months on heavy anxiety medication, barely able to get out of bed. The year she had signed whatever papers Marcus put in front of her because she could not summon the energy to read them. Oh God, Claire breathed. They got the document that afternoon. Victor Crane hand-delivered it to Evelyn's office with a smirk that made Claire want to scream. The signature was hers. She recognized her own handwriting, but she had no memory of signing it. The document was dated June 15, 2015, 3 weeks after her miscarriage, during the worst period of her life. "He did this on purpose," Claire said, staring at the paper. "He waited until I was at my lowest point and made me sign away everything." "Can we prove that?" Evelyn asked. "Medical records showing you were incapacitated?" "I was on prescription medication, antidepressants and sedatives. My doctor would have records." "Then we fight it," Evelyn said firmly. But before they could mount that fight, the next attack came. It started as a viral video on social media. Grainy footage showing Claire meeting a man in a coffee shop, hugging him, sitting close together, talking intimately. The caption read, "Billionaire wife had secret affair, new evidence surfaces." Within hours, the video had 10 million views. The comments were vicious. "Hypocrite, gold digger, she cheated too." Claire stared at the video in disbelief. "That is my cousin Michael," she said. "He lives in Boston. I had not seen him in 5 years. We met for coffee when he was visiting the city." But the internet did not care about explanations. The narrative had already been set. Claire Weston was a bitter, jealous woman who had cheated on her billionaire husband and was now trying to steal his money. The harassment started immediately. Death threats in her email. Strangers screaming at her on the street. Someone threw a brick through the window of Diane's bakery with a note that read, "Home wrecker." And then Betty Crawford was fired. Marcus terminated her employment without notice or severance, citing restructuring. He then made calls to everyone in his social circle, warning them not to hire her. Within a week, Betty was unemployable among the wealthy families of Manhattan and Connecticut. "He is destroying everyone who helps me," Claire said, her voice hollow with despair. "Anyone who stands with me gets crushed." She was sitting on the floor of Diane's apartment, her back against the wall, looking more broken than she had since that first day on the park bench. Evelyn sat across from her, equally exhausted. "The fake video is devastating," Evelyn admitted. "If we cannot prove it is innocent, Judge Monroe will have to consider it." "How do I prove a negative?" Claire asked. "How do I prove I was not having an affair?" There was a knock at the door. Diane opened it to find Betty Crawford standing there, her face drawn but determined. She was holding a thick envelope. "Mrs. Weston," Betty said, "I know you told me to stay away. I know he is trying to hurt anyone who helps you, but I have something you need to see." She handed Claire the envelope. "My daughter works as a paralegal at a law firm in Midtown. She heard something she should not have heard about how that video was created." Claire opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails between Victor Crane and a private investigator discussing how to stage and edit footage to make innocent encounters look romantic. And there was one more thing, a document with a familiar signature. The order to create the fake video had not come from Marcus. It had come from Tiffany Blake. "She has been planning this for years," Evelyn said, reading the documents. "Tiffany is not just a mistress. She targeted Marcus. She has been manipulating this entire situation. But why?" Claire asked. Look at this, Evelyn said, pulling out another page. Tiffany hired a private investigator 3 years ago, before she ever met Marcus. She researched his assets, his marriage, his weaknesses. She had a plan. Claire read the documents with growing horror. She wanted the company, Claire realized. She was never interested in Marcus. She wanted Weston Technologies. And she almost got it, Evelyn said. If Marcus had divorced you cleanly, married Tiffany, and then she could engineer his downfall later, she would have inherited everything. It was not just betrayal by her husband. It was a conspiracy. And Claire was standing in the middle of it, the target of forces she was only now beginning to understand. But as she sat there, holding evidence of the plot against her, something shifted inside Claire Weston. For 25 years, she had been the quiet one, the accommodating one, the one who avoided conflict and hoped things would get better. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had lost everything and found she was still standing. Someone who had been pushed to the absolute bottom and discovered that the only way left was up. Call Evelyn's forensic contacts, Claire said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. We need to prove that video is fabricated. Then we need to find out everything about Tiffany Blake. She looked at Betty and Diane, the two women who had stood by her when everyone else abandoned her. They think they have won because I am alone, Claire said. Let us show them what alone looks like when it fights back. The package arrived at Diane's apartment at 3 a.m. Emma Weston stood at the door, trembling in the cold October rain, clutching a USB drive like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to earth. Claire opened the door in her bathrobe, her face cycling through shock, pain, hope, and fear in the space of a single breath. Emma, she whispered. Her daughter did not speak, could not speak. The girl who had stood in that courtroom and called her mother emotionally absent now looked like she had not slept in days. Her expensive suit was wrinkled, her hair was disheveled, her eyes were red from crying. She held out the USB drive with a shaking hand. Mom, Emma finally managed, her voice cracking. I am so sorry. Claire pulled her daughter into her arms, and they both collapsed into sobs. It took an hour for Emma to calm down enough to explain what had happened. Diane made tea while Evelyn set up a laptop to examine the USB drive. Betty, who had been sleeping on Diane's couch for the past week, sat quietly in the corner, her face tight with emotion. I believed him, Emma said, her hands wrapped around her mug. Dad told me you were trying to destroy him. He said you were jealous of his success. He said the divorce was your revenge for him being more successful than you. She looked at her mother with anguished eyes. I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than thinking my father was a liar. What changed? Claire asked gently. Emma took a shaky breath. I was looking for a document in his home office, something for a business school application. I opened the wrong folder. She nodded toward the laptop, where Evelyn was examining the USB contents. It is all there. Emails, financial records, a file called Project Silence. Evelyn's face had gone pale as she scrolled through the files. Claire, she said quietly, you need to see this. Project Silence was Marcus's master plan, a 2-year operation designed not just to divorce Claire, but to completely destroy her. Phase 1. Financial isolation. Freeze all joint accounts. Bribe her lawyer to abandon her case. File mental instability. Claims to prevent her from accessing the residence. Phase 2. Social destruction. Leak edited footage suggesting infidelity. Plant stories in tabloid. Destroy the reputation of anyone who supports her. Phase 3. Family severance. Convince daughter to testify against mother. Use emotional manipulation and financial incentives to ensure loyalty. Phase 4. Legal annihilation. Produce second prenup signed during incapacitated period. Use Victor Crane's connections to influence court proceedings. Final objective. Claire Weston left with nothing. No money, no reputation, no family. Complete erasure. Claire read the document with a face carved from stone. She had known Marcus was cruel. She had not known he was this methodical in his cruelty. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was a separate folder labeled Emma. Inside were emails between Marcus and Tiffany discussing how to manipulate their daughter. "She is naive," Marcus had written. "Tell her what she wants to hear about being part of the company. She will do whatever I say." "Useful idiot," Tiffany had replied, just like her mother used to be. And there was one more document. A letter from Stanford University admissions, thanking Marcus for his generous donation and confirming Emma's admission to the business school. Emma's face crumpled as Claire showed her the file. "I did not earn my place at Stanford," Emma whispered. "He bought it." "No," Claire said firmly. "You graduated with honors. You worked harder than anyone in your class. Whatever he did to get you in, you earned your place by being brilliant." But Emma was not finished. "There is something else," she said. "Something I need to tell you about the forensic accountant. Gerald Morrison. The one who recanted his testimony?" Evelyn asked. "He did not recant because he was lying," Emma said. "He recanted because Dad threatened him. But before he did, he sent me a file. 6 months ago. I did not know what it was. I thought it was spam." "What file?" Claire asked. Emma took the laptop and navigated to an encrypted folder. "He sent me the real evidence," Emma said. "All the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the money trails. He encrypted it so Dad could not find it. And he sent it to me because he knew I would eventually need it." "Why you?" Evelyn asked. Emma looked at her mother. "Because he said in his note that daughters always figure out the truth eventually. He said when I was ready to see who my father really was, I would know what to do with it." Claire felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. "Can you decrypt it?" Claire asked. Emma managed a small, watery smile. "Mom, I graduated with honors in computer science. Of course I can decrypt it." She began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It took 3 hours to crack the encryption. When the files finally opened, they revealed everything. $200 million hidden in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Panama and Switzerland, evidence of securities fraud that could send Marcus to prison. And one more thing, a holding company called the First Light Trust that apparently owned controlling interest in Weston Technologies. "What is the First Light Trust?" Emma asked, frowning at the screen. Evelyn leaned in, reading the incorporation documents. "It is a private trust established in 2005, she said slowly. "The beneficiary is listed as the wronged party in any divorce proceeding involving infidelity by Marcus Weston." She looked up at Claire with astonishment. "Someone set this up to protect you. 20 years ago. Who would have done that?" Claire's mind raced through possibilities. Her family had no money. Her friends had no knowledge of trust law. The only person who would have had both the resources and the legal expertise was Dorothy, Claire breathed. "Who?" Diane asked. "Marcus's mother," Claire said. "Dorothy Weston. She died 5 years ago, but we were close. She never approved of how Marcus treated me. She used to say that her son had inherited his father's ambition, but not his integrity. She set up a trust to make sure you got everything." "If Marcus cheated," Evelyn said, shaking her head in amazement, "she must have known this day would come." Emma navigated deeper into the files and found a scanned document, a handwritten letter dated 2005, in Dorothy Weston's elegant script. "Dear Claire," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then my son has finally shown his true colors. I am sorry I could not stop him from becoming the man he is, but I could make sure that when the time came, you would have the power to save yourself. The first light. Trust transfers, controlling interest of all Weston holdings to you upon proof of infidelity during your marriage. Use it well, and please, take care of Emma. She is the only good thing Marcus ever created, and that is only because she is so much like you. With love and regret, Dorothy. Claire held the letter to her chest, tears streaming freely now. She knew, Claire whispered. All those years ago, she knew what he would become. Diane put her arm around her sister. Looks like you had a guardian angel you did not know about, she said. Emma reached out and took her mother's hand. What do we do now? Emma asked. Claire looked at her daughter, at her sister, at Betty and Evelyn, the unlikely army that had gathered around her. Now, Claire said, her voice steady with a strength she had not felt in years, we go back to court, and we finish this. The final day of trial arrived on a cold November morning. The Manhattan Supreme Court was surrounded by news vans and photographers, the story having grown from a celebrity divorce into something far larger. Rumors of fraud and hidden trusts had leaked to the press. Weston Technologies stock had dropped 15% in the past week. Marcus Weston walked into the courthouse with Tiffany Blake on his arm, but his stride was not as confident as it had been on that first day. Victor Crane walked beside him, his face tight with concern. They had heard about the daughter switching sides. They had heard about new evidence, but they did not know the full extent of what was coming. Claire entered the courtroom with Evelyn Rhodes, Emma, Diane, and Betty. They walked in together, a united front against the man who had tried to destroy them all. Judge Patricia Monroe took her seat and surveyed the packed courtroom. We are here for final arguments in the matter of Weston versus Weston, she announced. I understand there is significant new evidence to present. Miss Rhodes, you may proceed. Evelyn stood, and there was a new energy about her. The young lawyer, who had been dismissed as out of her league, was about to prove exactly which league she belonged in. Your Honor, she began, over the course of this trial, we have presented evidence that Marcus Weston built his entire company on intellectual property stolen from his wife. We have presented evidence that the original prenuptial agreement was signed under duress. We have presented evidence of a systematic campaign to destroy Mrs. Weston's reputation and relationships. She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom. Today, we will present evidence that changes everything. Evelyn called Emma Weston to the stand. Marcus leaned over to Victor Crane, his face pale. What is she doing? What does she have? I do not know, Crane admitted, but this is not good. Emma took the stand and was sworn in. She looked at her father for the first time, and her eyes were not angry. They were sad. Miss Weston, Evelyn began gently, you previously testified against your mother in this proceeding. Has your perspective changed? Yes, Emma said, her voice clear. I was manipulated by my father. He lied to me about my mother. He used me as a weapon against her. I deeply regret the pain I caused. Objection, Victor Crane called. The witness is clearly under the influence of opposing counsel. Judge Monroe gave him a withering look. Mr. Crane, a person is allowed to change their testimony when they discover new information. Overruled. Continue, Miss Rhodes. Miss Weston, Evelyn said, can you tell the court what you discovered in your father's files? Emma took a deep breath and described Project Silence. The courtroom listened in horrified fascination as she detailed her father's plan to destroy her mother financially, socially, and emotionally. Then she presented the evidence from Gerald Morrison. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the securities fraud, and finally she presented the First Light Trust. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Board members from Weston Technologies looked at each other in alarm. Victor Crane was furiously texting someone on his phone. "Order!" Judge Monroe commanded. She studied the trust documents carefully, her face revealing nothing. "Mr. Crane," she said finally, "does the petitioner wish to respond to this evidence?" Victor Crane stood slowly. For the first time in his career, he looked uncertain. "Your Honor, we need time to verify the authenticity of these documents. You have had 2 years to examine your own client's finances," Judge Monroe said dryly. "The court is not inclined to grant further delays." She turned back to Evelyn. "Miss Rhodes, please summarize your position." Evelyn stood tall. "Your Honor, the evidence shows that Marcus Weston stole his wife's intellectual property to build his company. He coerced her into signing a prenup. He concealed hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts. He committed securities fraud, and he orchestrated a deliberate campaign to destroy the woman who supported him for 25 years. She paused. "But most importantly, the evidence shows that the man who claims to own Weston Technologies does not actually own it. The First Light Trust, established by his own mother, holds controlling interest. And according to the terms of that trust, upon proof of infidelity, that interest transfers to the wronged spouse." She looked directly at Marcus. "Claire Weston is the rightful owner of Weston Technologies, and we ask this court to recognize that fact." The courtroom exploded. Reporters were typing furiously. Board members were on their phones. Tiffany Blake was already edging toward the exit. "Order!" Judge Monroe shouted, banging her gavel repeatedly. "Order in my courtroom." When the noise finally subsided, she turned to Marcus Weston. "Mr. Weston," she said, "do you wish to address this evidence?" Marcus stood slowly. His expensive suit suddenly looked rumpled. His confident posture had crumbled. He looked like a man watching his kingdom burn. "This is a conspiracy," he said, his voice cracking. "My mother was senile when she set up that trust. My wife manipulated her. This is all lies." Judge Monroe's expression did not change. "Do you have evidence that your mother was not of sound mind when she established the trust?" Marcus stammered. "I will get evidence. I need time." "You have had 20 years, Mr. Weston." Judge Monroe removed her glasses and looked at him directly. "I have presided over many cases in this courtroom. I have seen lies and truth in equal measure. But I have rarely seen someone so thoroughly convicted by their own actions." She put her glasses back on. "The court will take a brief recess to review all evidence before issuing its ruling. This session is adjourned." As the gavel came down, Claire looked across the aisle at her husband of 25 years. Marcus was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was fear. During the recess, Claire stepped outside for air. The cold November wind felt clean after the stifling tension of the courtroom. Diane found her on the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" Diane asked. Claire considered the question. "I feel like I spent 25 years being someone's shadow, and I am finally stepping into the light." She looked at her sister. "No matter what happens in there, I already won. I have my daughter back. I have you. I have the truth." Diane squeezed her hand. "You are going to get a lot more than that," she said. "I can feel it." The recess ended, and everyone filed back into the courtroom. Marcus looked like he had aged 10 years in 30 minutes. Victor Crane was whispering urgently in his ear, probably discussing damage control. Tiffany Blake was nowhere to be seen. "All rise." "Source," the bailiff announced. Judge Patricia Monroe entered and took her seat. She shuffled through papers for what felt like an eternity. Then she began to speak. Judge Patricia Monroe looked out over the courtroom with the weight of 35 years of experience behind her eyes. In my time on this bench, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, I have seen marriages end in tragedy and in relief. I have seen fortunes divided and families torn apart. But I have rarely seen a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between legal cleverness and actual justice. She looked directly at Marcus Weston. Mr. Weston, you walked into this courtroom believing that your money and your lawyers could erase 25 years of partnership. You believed that a woman who gave up her career to support your dreams was worth $5 million. You believed that intelligence and cruelty were the same thing. Her voice hardened. You were wrong. She shuffled her papers and continued. The evidence presented in this case is overwhelming. Claire Weston developed the algorithm that became the foundation of Weston Technologies. She did this while Marcus Weston was failing his undergraduate mathematics courses. The patent filed in 1999 should have borne her name. It did not, because Marcus Weston filed it while his wife was recovering from a difficult childbirth. She held up the documents from Professor Bennett. The original research notes, dated and witnessed by an academic review board, prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the intellectual property belonged to Claire Weston. Marcus Weston built a $30 billion empire on his wife's work and gave her no credit. Marcus shifted in his seat, his face ashen. Furthermore, Judge Monroe continued, the prenuptial agreement signed in 1998 was obtained through coercion. Multiple witnesses testified that Marcus Weston threatened to cancel the wedding unless Claire signed the document without reading it. A contract signed under such circumstances is not valid. She set that document aside. The second prenuptial agreement, dated 2015, was signed while Claire Weston was under the influence of prescription medications following a miscarriage. Medical records confirm she was not of sound mind during this period. This document is also invalid. 2 prenups, both worthless. Judge Monroe's voice grew colder, but the legal technicalities pale in comparison to the moral bankruptcy displayed in this courtroom. Project Silence. She held up the printouts Emma had provided, a 2-year operation designed to destroy a woman financially, socially, and emotionally. Frozen bank accounts, bribed lawyers, fake evidence of infidelity, the manipulation of a daughter against her own mother. She looked at Marcus with undisguised contempt. Mr. Weston, I have seen many cruel people in this courtroom. But the calculated, systematic nature of your campaign against the mother of your child places you in a category of your own. Marcus tried to stand. Your Honor, I can explain. Sit down, Mr. Weston. I am not finished. He sat. Judge Monroe held up the final document. The First Light Trust, she said, established in 2005 by Dorothy Weston, mother of the petitioner. The terms of this trust are clear and legally binding. Upon proof of infidelity by Marcus Weston during his marriage, controlling interest in all Weston holdings transfers to Claire Weston. She looked at Claire. Mrs. Weston, your mother-in-law knew exactly who her son was, and she spent the last years of her life ensuring that when this day came, you would have the power to protect yourself. Judge Monroe set down the document. It is the ruling of this court that Claire Weston is the rightful owner of the controlling interest in Weston Technologies, as specified in the First Light Trust. All offshore accounts held by Marcus Weston in violation of marital disclosure requirements are hereby frozen pending further investigation. The petition for divorce is granted, with all assets not protected by the trust to be divided according to equitable distribution principles. She paused. Additionally, the evidence of securities fraud and financial manipulation presented in this case will be referred to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted. Board members were shouting into phones. Reporters were running for the doors. Victor Crane looked like he might be sick. "Order," Judge Monroe commanded. "I am not finished." The room quieted. The court also takes note of the conduct of Victor Crane during these proceedings. Evidence suggests that Mr. Crane participated in bribing opposing counsel and fabricating evidence. This matter will be referred to the Bar Association for investigation. Victor Crane's face went from pale to gray. Finally, Judge Monroe said, looking directly at Tiffany Blake's empty seat, "The court issues a subpoena for Tiffany Blake regarding her role in creating and distributing falsified video evidence. Miss Blake is to surrender herself to the court within 48 hours." She gathered her papers. "This case represents everything that is wrong with how some people view marriage. They see it as a transaction instead of a partnership. They see their spouses as assets to be managed instead of human beings to be cherished." She looked at Claire. "Mrs. Weston, you spent 25 years supporting a man who did not deserve you. You raised a daughter who, despite being manipulated, found her way back to the truth. You endured a campaign of destruction that would have broken most people." Her voice softened slightly. "You did not break. And today, justice is served." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." Marcus Weston sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what had just happened. 20 minutes ago, he had been a billionaire. Now he was facing criminal charges, his company was gone, and his daughter was embracing his ex-wife across the aisle. Victor Crane was already packing his briefcase, probably calculating how quickly he could flee to a non-extradition country, and Claire Weston was standing in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by the people who had stood by her when everyone else abandoned her. "You did it," Diane said, tears streaming down her face. "You actually did it. We did it," Claire corrected. "All of us together." Emma held her mother tightly. "I am so sorry, Mom, for everything." Claire stroked her daughter's hair. "You found your way back. That is all that matters." Betty Crawford stood nearby, clutching her worn notebook. "Mrs. Weston," she said, "I do not know what to say." Claire turned to her and took both her hands. "You saved me, Betty." That notebook, 15 years of documentation. Without you, none of this would have happened. "I just wrote down what I saw," Betty said, her voice trembling. "Sometimes that is all it takes," Claire said. "Someone willing to see the truth and remember it." Evelyn Rhodes was accepting congratulations from other attorneys who had gathered to watch the verdict. The young lawyer, who had been dismissed as out of her league, had just won the most high-profile divorce case of the decade. "Miss Rhodes," a reporter called. "How does it feel to defeat Victor Crane?" Evelyn smiled. "It feels like justice," she said, "and it is long overdue." As Claire walked out of the courthouse, the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but she did not hear them. She was looking at the sky, breathing in the cold November air, feeling the weight of 25 years finally lifting from her shoulders. She had walked into this courthouse with nothing, no money, no lawyer, no hope. She was walking out as the owner of a $30 billion company. But more importantly, she was walking out with her daughter by her side, her sister at her back, and the knowledge that she had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. 6 months later, the world looked very different. Claire Weston stood at the window of her new office on the 32nd floor of what was now called First Light Technologies. The name change had been her first act as chairwoman of the board, a tribute to the mother-in-law who had protected her from beyond the grave. The Manhattan skyline stretched before her, glittering in the spring sunshine. It was the same view Marcus had enjoyed for 20 years, but Claire rarely spent time admiring it. There was too much work to do. Chairwoman Weston? Her assistant appeared in the doorway. Your 11 o'clock is here? Send her in, Claire said, turning from the window. Evelyn Rhodes entered, looking very different from the nervous young lawyer who had approached Claire in that courthouse hallway 6 months ago. She was now the head of First Light's legal department, with a staff of 20 and a reputation that had grown considerably since the Weston verdict. The restructuring documents are ready, Evelyn said, setting a folder on Claire's desk. We have completed the review of all offshore holdings. The total recovery is $214 million. Claire nodded. Transfer it to the foundation account. All of it, every penny. The First Light Foundation had been Claire's second major initiative. It provided legal support and financial assistance to women going through difficult divorces, particularly those facing wealthy and powerful opponents. In 6 months, they had helped over 500 women navigate the legal system. Evelyn smiled. You know, when you first told me about the foundation, I thought you might keep at least some of the money for yourself. I have enough, Claire said simply. More than enough. That money was stolen from our family. It should go to help other families. There was a knock at the door. Emma Weston entered, carrying a laptop and looking excited. Mom, you need to see this, Emma said. The beta test results are incredible. Emma had joined First Light Technologies as head of the new AI ethics division. Her job was to ensure that the company's technology was used responsibly, a stark contrast to the aggressive profit above all approach her father had championed. The educational software? Claire asked. Emma nodded eagerly. Test scores improved by 40% in the pilot schools. Teachers are saying it is the most effective learning tool they have ever seen. Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what she had always wanted the technology to do. Not just make money, but actually help people. Schedule a board meeting for next week, Claire said. I want to discuss expanding the pilot program. Emma made a note on her laptop, then hesitated. Mom, I need to tell you something. What is it? Emma took a deep breath. Dad's sentencing hearing is next month. His lawyer reached out. He wants to see me. Claire's expression remained neutral, but her hands tightened slightly on the edge of her desk. What do you want to do? Emma was quiet for a moment. I think I need to go, not to forgive him, but to finally say what I should have said 6 months ago. Claire nodded slowly. That is your choice to make. Whatever you decide, I support you. She walked around the desk and took her daughter's hands. Just remember that you do not owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not an explanation, not even your presence. You go because you choose to, not because he deserves it. Emma hugged her mother tightly. I know, she whispered. Thank you for understanding. Later that afternoon, Claire had a very different meeting. Betty Crawford sat across from her at a small cafe near the First Light Technologies building. Betty was now Director of Community Outreach for the First Light Foundation, a job she had initially tried to refuse. I still do not know how to have an office, Betty said, shaking her head. People keep asking me about budget projections, Claire laughed. You are doing wonderfully. The community programs you have developed are making a real difference. I just talk to people, Betty said. Listen to their stories, try to help where I can. That is exactly what they need, Claire said. Someone who actually listens. Betty was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Weston? Call me Claire, please. Betty smiled. Claire, do you ever regret it? The way things ended with Mr. Weston? Claire considered the question carefully. I regret the 25 years I spent trying to make something work that was never going to work. I regret not seeing who he really was until it was almost too late. I regret what it cost Emma to learn the truth about her father. She took a sip of her tea. But do I regret fighting back? Do I regret standing up for myself? Do I regret finally becoming the person I should have been all along? She shook her head. Not for a single moment. That evening, Claire attended a support group meeting at a community center in Brooklyn. She went every week, not as a leader or a donor, but just as another woman sharing her story. The group sat in a circle on folding chairs. There were lawyers and teachers and stay-at-home mothers. Some were in the early stages of their divorces, still shell-shocked and afraid. Others were further along, starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. A young woman named Jennifer spoke up, her voice trembling. "I do not know how you survived it," she said to Claire. "I read about your case. He tried to destroy you. How did you keep going?" Claire thought about the park bench where she had sat with $47 in her purse. She thought about the sleepless nights in Diane's apartment. She thought about the moment Emma had testified against her. "One day at a time," Claire said. "One small choice at a time." And by remembering that his version of me was never the real me, she looked around the circle at the faces of women who were fighting battles similar to her own. The man I was married to spent years trying to make me feel small, invisible, worthless. And for a long time, I believed him. I thought I was nothing without him. She leaned forward. "But here's what I learned. The story he told about me was not my story. It was his story about me, and I had the power to write a different one." Jennifer wiped her eyes. "But you had evidence. You had lawyers. You had resources. What about women who do not have any of that?" "That is exactly why the foundation exists," Claire said. "To make sure every woman has access to the same tools I had. No one should have to face this alone." After the meeting, Claire walked the familiar streets of Brooklyn to Diane's bakery. The window that had been shattered by vandals had been repaired, and the shop was busier than ever. People came from all over the city to buy pastries from the sister of the woman who had defeated Marcus Weston. Diane was behind the counter, covered in flour, looking happier than Claire had ever seen her. "You are late," Diane said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. "The meeting ran long," Claire replied. "Good conversations." Diane so studied her sister for a moment. "You know, you could buy 100 bakeries now. You do not have to keep coming here," Claire smiled. "This is where I came when I had nothing. This is where I found out who my real family was. I am not going anywhere." She looked around at the cozy shop, at the mismatched chairs, and the handwritten menu board and the photographs on the walls. "Besides," she said, "your croissants are still the best in Brooklyn." Diane laughed. "They are the best in Manhattan, too. Do not forget that." 1 year after the verdict, Claire Weston received a package at her apartment. It arrived without a return address, just a small manila envelope with her name written in careful handwriting she did not recognize. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Mrs. Weston, your husband was not the only one with secrets. There are 14 other women. I was one of them. The drive has everything. Maybe it is time someone told the whole story. A friend." Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the note for a long moment. Then she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The files that loaded were devastating. Names, dates, settlements, non-disclosure agreements going back 15 years. Women Marcus had harassed, manipulated, and paid off to stay silent. Administrative assistants, junior executives, interns barely out of college. 14 women whose stories had been buried under mountains of money and legal threats. Claire read through the files with a growing sense of horror. She had known Marcus was unfaithful. She had not known he was a predator. She picked up her phone and called Evelyn Rhodes. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "Claire, is everything okay? I need you to come to my apartment," Claire said. "Now." "There is something you need to see." When Evelyn arrived an hour later, she reviewed the files with her professional composure slowly crumbling. This is criminal, Evelyn said. Some of these women were coerced. Some were threatened. This is not just infidelity. This is a systematic abuse of power. What do we do? Claire asked. Evelyn looked up from the laptop. That depends. Do you want to go public with this? Claire was quiet for a moment, thinking about the 14 women whose names were on that drive. Women who had probably felt as trapped and helpless as she had felt for 25 years. I want to find them, Claire said. I want to give them the choice I never had. The choice to tell their story or not. The choice to seek justice or move on. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Marcus is already in prison for financial crimes, but those 14 women never got their day in court. They never got to stand up and say what happened to them. She turned back to Evelyn. We find them. We offer them support, legal help, financial assistance, whatever they need, and if they choose to come forward, we stand with them. Evelyn nodded slowly. This could be huge, she said. It could change the conversation about how powerful men treat women in corporate environments. Or it could be buried again, Claire said, like it was before. That is why we have to do this carefully. Protect the women first. Their safety and privacy come before any public statement. Over the next 3 months, Claire and Evelyn quietly reached out to the 14 women on the list. Some had moved on with their lives and wanted nothing to do with the past. Claire respected their choice, but 11 of them wanted to talk. They met in a conference room at the First Light Foundation. 11 women who had never met each other, but who shared a common experience. They shared their stories, some crying, some angry, all of them finally free to speak the truth. When the last woman finished, Claire stood up. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for trusting us with your stories. I know how hard this is." She looked around the room at these women, all of them survivors. I spent 25 years being afraid of Marcus Weston, afraid of his money, his lawyers, his power, and for a long time, I thought I was the only one. I thought no one would believe me. She took a deep breath. But I was not alone. None of us were alone. We were just kept apart, isolated, made to feel like our experiences did not matter. She walked to the window. What happens next is up to each of you. If you want to go public, we will support you. If you want to pursue legal action, we will provide attorneys. If you want to remain anonymous, we will protect your privacy. She turned back to face them. But whatever you choose, I want you to know something. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you are not alone anymore. One by one, the women in that room chose to come forward. The story broke 3 weeks later. 11 women accusing Marcus Weston of harassment, coercion, and abuse of power spanning 15 years. The media coverage was intense. There were denials from Marcus's legal team, quickly followed by silence as more evidence emerged. Marcus Weston's 12-year sentence for financial crimes was extended pending investigation of additional charges. His name became synonymous with corporate predation. But for Claire, the public reckoning was less important than the private healing. She watched these 11 women stand together at a press conference, supporting each other, speaking their truth. She saw the courage it took for them to face the cameras and tell their stories. And she knew that this, more than any courtroom victory, was what justice really looked like. On the anniversary of the verdict, Claire held a small dinner at Diane's bakery. Just family and close friends, Emma and Diane, Betty and Evelyn, the people who had stood by her when everything fell apart. "Toast," Diane said, raising her glass of wine, "to Claire, who proved that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous." Everyone laughed. "To family," Claire countered, raising her own glass, "the one you are born with and the one you choose. They clinked glasses. After dinner, Claire stepped outside for air. Emma followed her. "Mom," Emma said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." Emma was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars visible between the Brooklyn buildings. "Do you think Grandma Dorothy knew all along? About the other women, I mean?" Claire considered the question. "I think Dorothy knew her son better than anyone. She saw what he was unbecoming, and she could not stop it. So she did the only thing she could. She made sure that when the truth finally came out, there would be someone strong enough to do something about it. She put her arm around her daughter. She believed in me when I did not believe in myself, and she trusted that someday you would find your way back to the truth." Emma leaned into her mother's embrace. "I am glad I did," she whispered. "Me too, baby. Me too." They stood there in the cold night air, mother and daughter looking up at the stars. Behind them, through the bakery window, they could see Diane laughing at something Betty said. Evelyn was refilling wine glasses. It looked like a family. It was a family. And Claire realized that this, right here, was the happy ending she had never dared to hope for. Not the money, or the company, or the victory in court. Just this: love, connection, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had spent 25 years being someone's shadow. Now she was standing in the light, and she was never going back to the darkness again. 5 years later, Claire Weston retired as chairwoman of First Light Technologies. The company she had once helped build from nothing was now worth over $50 billion, and more importantly, it was known as one of the most ethical corporations in America. Emma Weston took over as CEO, the first woman to lead the company. Under her leadership, First Light became a pioneer in using technology to help survivors of domestic abuse, providing free security apps and legal resources to women in danger. Diane's bakery expanded to 3 locations, though she still worked the counter at the original Brooklyn shop every morning. She said the fancy new stores did not feel like hers. Betty Crawford retired at 65, but continued to volunteer at the First Light Foundation. She trained a new generation of advocates, teaching them the importance of documentation and attention to detail. Evelyn Rhodes became one of the most respected attorneys in New York, known for taking cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. She never forgot who gave her the first chance, and Claire Weston spent her retirement doing what she loved most: teaching mathematics at a small community college in Brooklyn, mentoring young women who reminded her of herself 30 years ago, writing a memoir that would become a bestseller and inspire a generation of women to stand up for themselves. She never spoke to Marcus again. He died in prison 2 years into his extended sentence. Claire did not attend the funeral, but she did visit Dorothy Weston's grave every year on the anniversary of the verdict. She would leave a single white rose and say a quiet thank you to the woman who had seen the truth and planned for the day when it would finally come to light. "The best revenge," Claire wrote in her memoir, "is not making him suffer. It is building a life so good that he becomes irrelevant. And that starts with one step: believing you deserve that life." If you have ever felt invisible in your own life, this story is for you. If you know someone going through a difficult time who needs to hear that things can get better, share this with them. And if you want more stories like this, stories of justice, courage, and women who refuse to stay silent, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release new stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Claire's position? Would you have fought back? Or would you have taken the settlement and walked away? Now, let us begin. Closing disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful entertainment with real-life lessons. Every story we create is designed not just to entertain, but to inspire, educate, and remind you that no matter how dark things seem, the truth always finds a way to rise. Thank you for being part of our community. Your support means everything. Now, here is the story of Claire Weston, the billionaire wife who lost everything and then took it all back.